Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
To most outsiders, New Haven is often known for two things: Yale University and pizza. But there's so much more to the city's present and past. This is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we explore the history of New Haven with Michael Morand. Earlier this year, he became the city's official historian. He's also director of community engagement at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. Michael, welcome to Disrupted.
Kalila, thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
I'm excited to talk to you because you have such a deep affinity for New Haven, but also a real understanding of what makes the city so complex and beautiful. Before we get into some of those details, share with our listeners how you came to New Haven and adopt this as your home.
Yeah, I started life at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Covington, Kentucky, and Kenton County in Kentucky. Grew up outside Cincinnati in Hamilton County and was there for through high school, and came to New Haven to go to college. Knew a little bit about the town, but came here because it was the place that Yale happens to be. And I looked at a lot of different colleges, and Yale sort of stuck out to me. And probably because of colleges like it, it's one that I knew people who had gone here. One of my high school teachers had gone here, and somebody who lived on my street. My grandparents, none of them went past 8th grade. My dad went to college, Xavier University on scholarship. My mom didn't go to college. It was my generation in my family. It's first that going to college was normal. And I looked at a lot of colleges in the Northeast, and there was something about Yale that called out to me, and it might have been that we visited New Haven too. So I came here in 1983 to be a student at Yale, not thinking about where I'd be 41 years later, but happy that I've stayed here in this town that is at once large enough to be interesting and small enough to be friendly.
So tell me what has kept you in New Haven. A lot of people come to Yale. They don't really experience New Haven beyond the confines of the university. What was it about this place that made you stay?
I mean, New Haven is an easily met place if you choose to meet it. I realize coming from a place where in some ways the atmosphere is, hey, y'all, how you doing? Come on in. That's not the New England way. And it can seem a little frosty on the surface here. And I always tell people who are coming from far away, you might need to knock on doors and introduce yourself a little bit more. Folks here on the surface might seem a little bit New England frostier, but they're just as welcoming as anywhere else. And if you make the initiative and you're authentic, people here welcome you. The state motto is quid transilet sustenat, the one who transplanted sustains. And so this notion of land of steady habits always is the way that it was is actually not true. Dynamism is baked into the genetic fabric of this place. But if you take the effort, you're welcomed. And I have found this to be a place full of people who are fiercely passionate about it. And that's infectious to me. And I've become one of those people too.
You have also become a tremendous ambassador for the city of New Haven, not just locally, but really internationally and globally. You now have an official title to something that those of us who are familiar with you and your work know that you have done far longer. You earlier this year was named as the city historian for the city of New Haven. How did that position come to be for you? And what's your dream for what you'll do?
Yeah, the city historian role dates to the America's bicentennial and a state effort to sort of have enabling legislation to now allow municipalities to have this role. There have been two in New Haven before, both great friends, Dick Hagel and Judy Schiff, late of blessed memory. And Judy died in office in 2022, so the office was vacant and been talking to the mayor, doing all kinds of stuff, and he was kind enough to ask me if I'd be willing to do it. And, it's the kind of thing, it's got no money to it, no budget, no pay. It does give you the capital letters of the title, and that's nice. But the spiritual rewards are great, and I've been doing this kind of work with lots of people. My hope is that we can really become a place that, as it were, is known for a pizza and archives. Our superpower includes our scale. We are a place where people can get to know each other, and we've got more stuff of history. Archives, historic buildings, cemeteries, community memory organizations, churches, synagogues that care about their history. More of that per capita in a very compact place than anywhere else in America. So we have the ability to be a place that is not only full of people who care about history, but people who make history, preserve history, and pass it along. So my hope is by the time we're some years past America 250, that New Haven will be at an even higher level, and that you go anywhere. You go to the corner of any street and talk to folks. They know something about history and care about it. Because I also think, and this has certainly fueled me here, the more you know about a place, the more you feel connected to its history, even if it's not your own blood history that from 3 centuries ago, but it's a history that you inherit, you're more likely to care about it, to give a darn, and to try and make it better. So the hope is make history alive and have it in the service, not of some nostalgic past, but a living history that fuels a better tomorrow for us. And that, of course, means you have to engage not just with the good parts, but with the tough parts, because you want to both remember the resources from before and the heroic people, but you also need to know the mistakes that were made so that you don't repeat them.
I want us to talk about some of those mistakes and the legacies of those mistakes and missteps and decisions. Before we get there, though, I'm curious, Michael, you have a reverence for history as a living experience and as a connection to community and to people and to worth. Juxtapose that against the times that we are in this country, where there seems to be a committed attack to not just ignore history, but to sanitize history in a way so that people are no longer uncomfortable about that or not forced to confront those ugly tenets of history that even get us here today. How important is it then for you as a city historian to put forth this idea that, yes, confronting history can be difficult, but it is necessary, especially in these times?
Yeah, it's been said in various ways that who controls the past controls the present and the future. And people in power sometimes like to rewrite history, unwrite history, hide or ignore history because they don't want people to know how we got where we are, and they don't want people to be equipped to figure out how we can move forward in a better way. So the status quo sometimes is supported by people doing what we would call hagiography, just the good parts, but not talking about everything that happened. So it does matter. And I think the role of historians generally, and in this case a municipal historian, is not to be the people who make the policy. We're not the ones who can tell you here's the solution, but as it were, to be the people who provide the ingredients for the cooks, and the cooks being policymakers, politicians, activists, advocates, people who work and run institutions. So to make that, make sure the cupboard is full so that people can do the right cooking and put the menu for the future out. And that, again, involves making sure that we know all the parts, the good parts, the bad parts, the parts that are just normal, routine stuff, and that we know the full history of all the people who are involved. Too often we do sort of great man or great woman history, or the first deserve all the props, but it's more interesting, and their firsts are more important when there's a 20th and a 200th. So knowing all the communities and, as it were, the unsung heroes is a very important part of this work. That also allows people to see themselves in history. We're not all going to be the great person. Most of us aren't, but we all got a role to play, and there's lots of people we can learn from and see ourselves in the past.
You are someone who also appreciates nuance and texture and context. And it comes through in so many of the spaces that you move through, but also the ways that you are able to connect to people in a moment. As an historian, as a student of history, and as really an ambassador of that, what are some things that you may notice as you are moving through New Haven that other people may overlook or take for granted that makes you say, this is an ingredient that we should pay attention to?
One of the things is walking over here from Beinecke Library across the green down here to Gateway in this great campus and the great studio of Connecticut Public is, we are not a north, south, east, west town. Our grid is a little bit off kilter, and that is because of the geography of the English and how the English settlers came here and marked the land where the harbor was, and it said that one point of the 9-square grid is sort of between East Rock and West Rock, but it's laid out around creeks and waterbeds and those kinds of things. And geography is not completely destiny, but it shapes things. And so, we're not like New York or Chicago, a perfect north, south, east, west. We're a little north, northwest. We're a little bit off kilter. And I think that's sort of fun. It's like, figuring out exactly where's west is not always possible here. And it makes us a little bit unique. And there is something about this place that we have an authenticity to us. We're not just any place USA. And that's been true from the beginning. And, it's not all great, but we are ourselves. And that's something to hold on to in a time of sort of ersatz, everything looks the same. We have lots of buildings in town now that could be in Kokomo or Baltimore, these 4 and 5 over 1 kind of stuff. But holding on to what's authentically ourselves is a very important part of it. And I like that our street grid is that it's a little different,
It's a little different. New Haven is a little different. Yale is a little different. You sit at this really interesting intersection of the city of New Haven and Yale University, given your work as city historian, but also at the Beinecke. What can the Beinecke, as a space within this sort of ecosystem of all the things that are happening, what can the Beinecke help us pay attention to as we're learning about the city of New Haven?
I mean, among other things, it's a really cool place, right? Architecturally, it's stunning. The Black Panther comics that are still out by Marvel had an issue in 2017, and they had the Wakandan Royal Library in the storyline. And the illustrator, Wilfredo Torres, Ta-Nehisi Coates was the writer of this particular issue. The illustrator used the Beinecke to illustrate the Wakandan Royal Library. It's a copy of where I work. And that just goes to show how much of a power the place has. We will have more than 200,000 people come through the revolving doors this year, good chunk of them from campus and many, many from New Haven and from Connecticut. And there aren't many places like it. And people walk in and the sonic landscape is, and you can sort of catch them and hopefully convert some of them into being lifelong interested in history. Maybe they're not going to go on and get a PhD, but we generally find when you have high school kids, 10% of them hang back and they want to talk more. And those are the future Kalilas and me and people like that. And so having this cool place that can reach so many people, that's free and open 7 days a week, has a lot of online and in-person programming, gives us an opportunity here again. And the other part of it is in my work on campus and in the community, I always realize if we're doing it organizationally alone, we're almost always doing it wrong. And there's power in networks and associations. Again, the superpower of New Haven, frankly, of Connecticut, our scale, having multifaceted partners, community memory groups, other libraries and repositories, public and nonprofit. There's all kinds of things we can do in this small town and build each other up. And we're blessed at the Beinecke to be literally in the center of town, so there's a value in that. We tend to do things on Sundays as much as we can because parking's free. The one thing that's tough is parking sometimes. But being a convener and a connector is one of the things we look to do. And we're building up an informal archives network in New Haven because we have, again, more stuff. Southern Connecticut's got extraordinary archives. The Blessed Michael McGivney Pilgrimage Center, New Haven Museum, is 10 times the scale you would expect of a local history museum in a place like ours. The Ethnic Heritage Center, the New Hart Museum at the Dixwell Q House. I could go on and on and on. And when we work together, we can do some amazing things and can really look to be ubiquitous with history in this town. We've got enough resources, people, organizations to literally connect all 139,000, going to 150,000 residents as active participants in knowing and making history. So that's one of the, the sort of role I see Beinecke playing, and we're blessed to have Barbara Rockenbach, Michelle Light, other great leaders in Yale Library and across campus, totally supportive and keen on this, is we can be a catalyst and a connector and use the asset of this amazing building that blows people's minds to hopefully, again, convert them into active participants in history.
Coming up, New Haven's historian Michael Morand explains how institutions can be slow to reckon with their past. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're exploring New Haven's history with Michael Morand. Back in April, Michael became the official city historian of New Haven. He's also director of community engagement at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. For many years, Michael has been looking into Yale's historic ties to slavery as part of the Yale and Slavery Research Project. This February, he co-created an exhibit at the New Haven Museum. It's called Shining Light on Truth, New Haven, Yale, and Slavery. Ask Michael about the exhibit.
I mean, that comes out of overall reckoning that Yale has been doing in recent years, building off generations of scholarship and knowledge. People say, when did this work begin? I said, the history's been being done for 300 years. But this is a contemporary reckoning institutionally. Yale has joined many, many places, and we have to give credit to Ruth Simmons at Brown, who really led the effort beginning in 2004. There's now 100 institutions that have done this kind of work, higher ed, and there are other organizations, churches, and others around the country that have done similar work. But Dr. Simmons really was the one who called people to do this. Yale could have done it before, chose not to, and literally chose not to. So we need to be humble about that and recognize and respect and acknowledge those who really did blaze the trail. It's never too late to do the right thing, so it's good that our institution is now really fully and deeply doing it. Peter Salovey and Susan Gibbons and others deserve a lot of credit, our trustees. David Blight has led a team doing research, writing a book that I was a part of along with Hope McGrath. And this exhibition is part of that effort. And it has really proven to be useful because this is a history that has been long ignored by the dominant culture. It's a tough history, and it's a history that because there's been such generations of silence from a dominant culture perspective, it is useful to have it in a three-dimensional embodied place where you encounter it in real time and place, walking around a museum, oftentimes in conversation with other people. That's good for people who need to know this history who didn't know it, and that's also a useful way for those who know this history very well and carry the embodied trauma of generations to be able to be with other people in real time and space and to sit and reflect. And we've got a space where literally people can sit and reflect. And no disrespect for books or things that we read online. I help write the book. I love books. I work in a library. But it is useful to have embodied knowledge, which this story is. This is a story that has been carried by people and churches and organizations in their bodies and organizations. To have it expressed in a three-dimensional way and doing it at the New Haven Museum, great colleagues, a wonderful resource, has been really powerful because that allows us to do it in a place that's quite close to campus. Campus folks have great access, but it is literally a public-facing place on a public street. Made sure that admission is free through the run of the show, which is through March 1st, 2025. We've had more than 5,000 people come through, including lots and lots of school kids and teachers. And part of the reason we extended it to March at the New Haven Museum's request is so that we can reach even more young people. So it really has been a powerful way. And one of the things that I have found is people say, I had no idea. And again, books help break through in that, but having it where you're encountering it in real time and space with other people is even more powerful for breaking through and having people then go forth. And in the exhibition, we close with a quote from the great Elizabeth Alexander, somebody who's as of New Haven and as of Yale as anybody. Her dad went to Yale. Her late husband is buried here. He went to Yale. Her kids went to Yale. She went to Yale. And Elizabeth, when the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened, noted that history favors not the period, but the bold colon and the ellipses, the ... And we closed the exhibition with ... to remind people that this is not done and that they are sent forth to be knowers and hearers and doers of the word so that it's ongoing and they have a role.
What I find so powerful about this is that it's not just a visual reminder, it's also a visceral reminder that for me as someone who grew up in Virginia, people are often shocked that Connecticut dealt with these challenges, that New Haven had any connection to slavery. I think people try to dismiss that as a Southern problem.
Right.
And what this exhibit shows is that no, this is a national problem. This is a global problem that we still see the remnants of it today. As you are thinking about this exhibit, are there particular stories of enslaved people that stood out to you, or that even for you as an historian and a lover of history said, wow, I didn't know that, or that disturbed me in a way that perhaps you didn't expect?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say both. There's stuff that is disturbing, the ubiquity, as you were noting, and again, breaking through the decades of accumulated dominant culture, silence, and ignorance. William Lloyd Garrison called in 1835 Connecticut the Georgia of New England, and that helps. And he was a little hyperbolic, but still, that helps sort of us disabuse ourselves of these inherited notions that we were the good guys, abolitionist Connecticut. It was all Amistad. There's a lot more, and Connecticut was, white supremacy knows no boundaries. So it's not a north-south kind of thing. The Mason-Dixon line is artificial. And our economy was built on the transatlantic slave trade as the economy of New England, as the economy of the colonies and the early nation. So the ubiquity is disturbing, but it's useful to know and to remind that it is really deep. And those roots, who built this place, we need to know. And the positive is to see the resources of resistance and the ubiquity of organizing, writing, and resistance, and making a way where there was no way. And there are all kinds of stories, many of which have happily begun to be better known. William Lanson is a good example. And there are 20 and 200 and probably 2,000 more. And that constellation of people gives us access to history is not static. You can make history. Resistance is possible. Progress is possible. It takes work. These were not people who just waited for divine intervention. They did the work. Many of them were fueled by a belief in the divine. And that has been the positive thing. Jacob Oshun, a person who needs to be better known, who in 1817 writes what many historians consider to be the first Black history by a Black person, that has a positive statement of identification with Black African, a sort of early proto-Pan-African. 1817. Published in New York based on a talk he gives in New Haven. He's in New Haven or buried in the Grove Street Cemetery with his wife and kids. William Grimes, a story that's getting better known, Bias and Margaret Stanley. There are so many of these stories that are right here. And some of them are literally very visible. You walk in the Grove Street Cemetery, the nation's oldest organized public burial ground, and you look to the left. That's where Vashti Creed and John Creed and Bias Stanley and Margaret Stanley and Peggy Jones and Jacob Oshun, Du Bois's grandfather, William Grimes, Clarissa Caesar Grimes, they're all here. And that's been, I think, part of the work here. My brilliant colleague, David John Walker, who with Charles Warner Jr. and I were the three of us, are the key people in the exhibition. DJW talks about this being the work of excavating the shallow grave of history. This is not a deep grave that we have to go. So it's here if you want to do the work. And it doesn't even necessarily take that much. And once you realize that, you can see it's all around inscribed. Connecticut Hall, the oldest building on the Yale campus, the oldest standing building on the campus, the oldest standing building in town, first brick building in Connecticut, built in part by free and enslaved Black people. Knowing that gives us access to history, to the stories of resistance, and also to recognizing the founders of Yale and the founders of New Haven are not only John Davenport, Theophilus Eaton, Elihu Yale, Ezra Stiles, Jonathan Edwards. There's a lot more people, and we need to know their names. Jethro Luke, Minewell Luke, Gad Luke, and many, many more.
There will be people who will see this exhibit, who will hear our conversation, and ask this very simple question. Why now? Why now, given the history of this sort of tenuous relationship? Why now, given the challenge to rename a residential college named after John Calhoun, to change that? All of those pieces of the historical connection that make some people question the motive or the integrity behind it. What do you say to that question of why now?
Again, credit to Dr. Ruth Simmons at Brown, who did why now because she knew this. She carried it in her bones and in her body and in her mind and knew this needed to be done, was a pioneer in this kind of work. Yale had the opportunity a number of years before and was called out by some graduate students to do this and chose not to, consciously chose not to in 2001, to not deal with the full history. So we're late at doing this. And this year on Juneteenth, I was thinking, Juneteenth is a celebration of resistance and liberation. It also, in some ways, is a holiday of white lateness. And we are keeping with that. And white people have been late a long time. And when you look at why and when things have happened, we have to be honest. It has been because black people have led. And oftentimes it has been spurred because there has been the sacrifice of black lives. The massacre in Charleston was part of what fueled reckoning here and in other places to deal with Calhoun. We didn't choose to do it just because it was the right thing. It took pain and suffering. We need to be honest about that and reckon with what that means. 2020, it was the death of George Floyd that called the nation together. It wasn't because as a national dominant culture we thought, good time to do stuff. It was because we had no choice. And we need to be honest and humble about that. And as we do this work, hopefully bake into, let's make sure we do the honest storytelling more going forward. We're never going to be perfect, but that we bake that in, that this is not just every once in a while there's a crisis, so that we have fewer crises in the future. I had the extraordinary privilege of eating with Desmond Tutu not long after he had finished the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And he said to me, as I'm sure he said to everybody at the time, Michael, the problem with your country is you never did this. Ignoring a problem did not make the problem go away. You don't have to be rocket scientists to know that. And too often we have only done this hard work when we've been forced to by people protesting for all the right reasons and because there's been pain and suffering, oftentimes death. We should figure out ways that we do this as a regular basis, just like you do wellness checkups with your doctor. We should do that about our society and our history on a regular basis.
I'm curious now about, we're starting to appreciate more the history of resistance in New Haven. We are starting to appreciate more the greatness that has come from this city. And yet I often feel like, of course there's more to be done, but I think about a daughter of New Haven like Constance Baker Motley, where there are more permanent memorials or ways of honoring Motley outside of New Haven and outside of Connecticut, frankly, than we see right here. And to understand what it meant for the Motley family to go from working at a place like Yale, where they never could have imagined that their children would have attended, to having a daughter like Constance Baker Motley who couldn't attend Yale because of her race and gender and all sorts of other factors, to have such an impact on this country and on the system of law and justice. How do we move toward a recognition, not just of what was, which is what we're starting to do, but also honoring the more recent parts of that history and that legacy? How do we do that?
Yeah, and I think, it is true. A prophet is often without honor in their own backyard. So we're not the only place that doesn't necessarily, you got to go outside to hear who the great people are. But it's true here, that there's oftentimes celebrations beyond and not as much at home you take for granted sometimes. And we do have outsized number of greats going way back, way back. Oshuna, who I mentioned, William Grimes, the petition that Bias Stanley and William Lanson did to the legislature in 1814 for black franchise. All kinds of things, down to Constance Baker Motley and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore in the current time. To think about a daughter of New Haven who is a leader in resistance and building a more beloved and liberated community. So I'm really excited because we have a time now with the world of festivals, the International Festival itself, the Q House, the Ethnic Heritage Center, the work that City Hall is doing, and got to shout out Adrienne Jefferson and the whole team that she's catalyzed at having a cultural equity plan. So we're in a good place as a community. You're very much personally part of it, as well as the work you do here on Disrupted and what you do in your academic life and integrating all those things. So building structures, which doesn't necessarily mean permanent, but sometimes it is permanent and endowed kind of stuff. I'm excited to be part of the Community Foundation. And all of us should look to America 250 as a way where we build up the infrastructure of community memory. I'm excited about work we're doing with the New Haven Free Public Library. It's very beginning days, so I don't want to I want to underpromise and we want to overdeliver. But to build community memory labs in the library and in libraries so that people can do more recording, scanning, reformat old digital materials. So we're at very beginning days of this sort of community archives program. And again, the more it's distributed all around, it doesn't belong just to this library or that school or this organization, but we all own it and have many more things. Again, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, think about the fantastic mural that Lauren Anderson in Possible Futures has done. It's great community art all around. So I'm pretty excited, and I hope if we organize ourselves and collaborate with each other, make space for each other, build each other up, America 250 is going to be a good marker for that. And I think in this world, it makes me think some of the eclipse that just passed. 6 months in advance, nobody was thinking about the eclipse. Come the day, everybody had their glasses on. America 250, July 4th, 2026 is going to be like that. I'm old enough to have been here for the bicentennial. And it was a great time, not just of fife and drum and fireworks, but of real local history, really diverse and inclusive history. You think about something like Roots, and Alex Haley is one of the living legacies. So it's an opportunity, if we organize ourselves well, and for the institutions, community memory groups, citizens, government, philanthropic organizations, to make sure we've got a more robust infrastructure, recognizing that we've got a pretty darn good one now. But we can go so much higher and so much longer so that when America turns 300, we can have a lot more. And one key part of that is to also recognize the people who were here for a long time. Other communities, other parts of Connecticut have done more to know and reckon with the indigenous presence. It's not that it's not done here, but I think that's an area where we have a lot more to do in immediate New Haven city of and the New Haven region. So hopefully we'll do more of that as well and recognize and give honor to those who were here 5,000 and 8,000 years ago into the living presence of indigenous people in this region as well as throughout the state.
Coming up, more on the history of New Haven with the official city historian, Michael Morand. He'll explain how New Haven almost became home to the country's first Black college. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're spending time in New Haven, Connecticut. We're here with the city's official historian, Michael Morand. He's also Director of Community Engagement at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. As city historian, Michael has been pushing New Haven to reckon with some uncomfortable truths. That includes that the city almost became home to the very first Black college in the U.S. In 1831, the city's white community leaders rejected a proposal to create that college. It would have been where the I-95 and I-91 interchange exists today. So in August of this year, the late New Haven alder Tom Ficklin Jr. proposed a resolution on Michael Morand's behalf. That resolution would have the city of New Haven apologize for rejecting the proposed college. I asked Michael to tell us more about the college.
September 10th, 1831 was a day when Hope Unborn was killed in New Haven. There was a bold proposal that came from Black leaders in New Haven and throughout the nation with white allies to build what would have been the first HBCU, historically Black college or university, in New Haven. New Haven was seen as a good place to do it because then as now, a place that believed in education, close to New York, but not New York. So it was close to the center, but not as busy. And it was a place that had ties to the Caribbean. And as Haiti and Jamaica and other places were liberated, there would be a rising interest in Black people there to study as well as Black people in the U.S. Would have been a great fuel for liberation, for self-development, community development, and for political liberation, as HBCUs have proven to be so essential for building up communities and the nation as a whole. And would have, in some ways, fueled liberation even earlier. Mentioned Du Bois before. His grandfather was here. What if W.B. Du Bois's grandfather had gone to an HBCU in New Haven? What if William Grimes' kids? Just think about those things. And that's the what could have been. We know what places like Howard, founded in 1867, have done for the nation and for the D.C. community and for the world. Think about that if something had begun here in 1831, what that would have meant for New Haven, for Connecticut, for the nation, for the world. We can't rewrite history, but knowing that history should allow us to think about what could have been, and that, again, the historian helped share that story so that the policymakers, the philanthropists, the citizens, the activists, the residents can decide what should be done. Because it's no good if we just tell the story and then people say, that's an interesting story. That, it's like going to see a fiction movie. This has got to be living history. And we're really working hard to make sure people know about it. And again, not to tell people what should be done, but for us to hold ourselves accountable that we need to do something. Because this opportunity lost in 1831 had a real opportunity cost. This was not just like, oh, that's an interesting thing that didn't happen. There is intergenerational wealth disruption that happened. And we need to reckon with that and set ourselves, again, can't go back and unwind the clock. But we got a clock now going forward, and we should govern ourselves going forward, thinking about what could have been and then do things to make sure that we make up for what didn't happen.
Tell us more about the opposition, because so many of the historically Black colleges and universities that were founded in the South were intentionally done so to recognize the need for education, even if it was just creating a new workforce at the ending of slavery for some people. But the idea that, yes, we need education, but we want to keep it separate. We want to keep people from certain spaces, so we'll create other spaces. What was the nature of the opposition to building a college here in New Haven?
I realized how naive I was before, because I used to read about all these incredible educated, self-educated Black leaders in New Haven and thought, how come the white people didn't get it? It was really clear. They're smart people. Why didn't? And then I realized the white people did get it. It was because they were smart. They were a threat. And white supremacy and the power that people had was threatened by Black people having success and education. That's why there was opposition. And it was opposition up and down. 700 to 4, the town meeting, which was white men eligible to who owned property were eligible to vote. There were only 4 people who stood against it, against the resolutions against the college, stood for the college. So it was the dominant order in the entire community. And when you look at the conversation, which included not just the vote, but assaults on property of Black people who supported the college and of white allies, the conversation is one that remains familiar over time. If this college happens, white people will have to give way on the sidewalk. If this college happens and they're educated, next thing, they will want to marry the white women. It will lead to amalgamation. It will lead to the purity of the white race will be threatened. All the things that have, before and after and continue to have echoes to this day. And we, again, need to reckon with it. It's part of the reason why Garrison called this the Georgia of New England. It is a story that we need to know and need to really reckon with, figure out why it happened, and make sure that we govern ourselves now that this doesn't happen and open up opportunity. And I have to say, as a human being, as a white human being, as a queer person, I realize in my own life the truth that scholars have been saying for a long time and that Black activists have been saying. The full realization of American democracy has been driven by the Black liberation struggle. The realization of the sacred scripture of we hold these truths to be self-evident has been because of the Sojourner Truths and Frederick Douglass's and many people whose names we don't know, striving not only for their own and their own community's liberation, but that has led to liberation in space, women's rights, queer rights. All of those things come from the original source of liberation in our country, which is the Black liberation struggle. So this is not just a matter of interesting historical record. That's interesting. But it is a thing that is about life and liberation for all of us. And that, I think, is part of what fuels me, is to realize I'm a freer person in 2024 than I was as a kid growing up, because things don't get better all the time, but there has been progress. And that progress has as its source the inspiration and persistence of Black people and other people learning from that example to make this democracy a realer, fuller place.
How do you center that authenticity in the work that you do? Because you are often telling the stories of people who are intentionally marginalized, who were overlooked, who were exercised out of the polity and out of the process. And you bring an authenticity and a sense of real cultural humility to the work that you're doing. As an outsider, I see it as you don't do that work alone. Like, you are intentional about that partnership. But how do you center authenticity in these spaces so that that drives the work?
In the case of my own, I credit parents and Helen Lemkel Morand, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who was the most humble person and had basically no school education, but she was a wise person. And she kept her door open, raised 8 kids on her own for most of the time. Her husband, my paternal grandfather, had died. And she didn't have much, but she kept the door open so anybody could come in and get food from the kitchen. And one of my aunts once said to her, "Why do you do that?" And she said, "Dear, it may be St. Joseph coming in." And faith was a big part of it. And when we look at texts of faith, it says, love the Lord, love your neighbor. And then the next set of things that are there the most is love, mercy, humility. So I'm grounded in those kinds of things and generations of people who were good, regular folk. And it's good to be a good, regular folk. And recognize that the power in our community comes not from the high and mighty, but from the good, regular folk doing good, regular things. And it's, a challenge, I think, in 2024 for all of us, because the rewards of social media are all likes and clicks, and I work in an institution. It's a great institution. Humility is not necessarily something that we teach at Yale. But we do have resources in our own founding stuff as an institution, and we don't need to go back and be that kind of denominational place. But humility and faith is part of it. And I'd say, in sort of closing on that thought, I think about this a lot at Grove Street Cemetery. When you walk in, what you see are an extraordinary set of Black people's graves that was, at the opening of the cemetery, the back end. The cemetery grew, and when it was reconfigured, it becomes the major spot. And I always say it is the living embodiment of a line of faith that we know is true because it's in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian New Testament, and the sacred lyrics of Robert Nesta Marley. And if something is Jewish, Christian, and Rasta, it's right. And that's simply the stone that the builder rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And it is in those margins that we actually find the center and find the future and build the future. So reading the future by the past of those who were forgotten and ignored, but who actually did the work, is the way to move forward.
What's your hope for New Haven's future?
That we build from the strongest parts, which is a place of great welcome and inclusion. It is a place that is rooted in its past. We will celebrate nearly 4 centuries of English colonial settlement. We need to know more about the indigenous presence here. So we've got this great through line, but it is a through line that is accessible to all of us. We may not have been born here, or may not come from generations that are 3 or 4 generations back. Most people aren't. But we can inherit the best part of the spirit of the place, which is a place that welcomes people and where if you have a fierce commitment, you will be welcomed, and where people work together for the common good.
I'm thinking about the arc of our conversation, and you have really brought us full circle. I often feel like New Haven is a city that is characteristic of many cities across the U.S. and still has this element of being very special and unique. It is a city that when I originally moved here, I thought, we'll be here a few years, maybe 5 at the most. I now have lived in New Haven longer than I have lived anywhere else, including my beloved Virginia. When you think about what makes New Haven special, it's almost like asking someone, who's your favorite poet or who's your favorite child? What is the thing that stands out to you that you say, if only you knew this about New Haven, it would endear you the way it has endeared us?
A generic thing and a specific thing. The generic is the scale. this is sort of like a Goldilocks thing. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. I mean, we're just the right size. We really are just the right size. And can have some more people, so more people are welcome to come. So I'm not saying the population has to be static, but we're a good-sized place where you can know each other. And you bump into people and you can build relationships. That's not possible in places too small or underwhelming, and places that are too big or overwhelming. So scale is one. The second is it really is predestined. There's a book I love by John Warner Barber, one of my heroes, one of the few white people who backed the Black College, great historian in the 19th century, self-taught guy. Wrote a book in 1831 called The History and Antiquities of New Haven, where he reports a letter where somebody said about the banks of the Mill River that there was a spot along the banks of the Mill River that was denominated the seat of happiness. Not a seat of happiness, Kalila, but the seat of happiness. So if you didn't know it, New Haven is the place where the seat of happiness is.
I mean, it makes me happy in many ways, the possibilities of it all, the idea that there are people, hardworking people, who want the same thing, even if they have very different approaches to getting there. My last question to you is a little broader than just New Haven. I think about generations, right? And the stories that get buried with our elders when we don't share them, and how young people can be inspired by the things right in front of them. What would you say to people who are curious about history, about exploring their own histories, but maybe a little intimidated about how they start or how they position themselves to take that on? What do you say?
That's why we're doing a lot of work with the public libraries, Jennifer Coggins and others doing presentations where say to people, you have history. I happened to be on another radio show at Top 40, and I walked in and the guy said, "You don't look like a historian. You look like you're going to a rock and roll concert." And I said to Chaz and AJ, doesn't everybody have a history? Doesn't everybody look like a historian? So part of it's to model that and to meet people where they are. And I have found when you ask young people why they're interested in history, they're all interested. And some of it's, sort of just as they're interested in futuristic stuff, it's like one of the young people in the museum said, it's like detective work. And so open it up and meet people and realize that, I'm not an expert. I just know a lot of stuff because I've been around and I'm connected. And I know it because I know other people who are smart. And activating those networks, having people understand that they've got the power and the resources and that their story matters too. Having them see it in museum exhibitions and murals, in curriculum. And again, we are a place because of the scale that we can have ambassadors for history and really blanket this place. And we're getting well there, I think, to being a place where it is ubiquitous. And meeting people where they are, practicing a ministry of presence.
Well, we are grateful that you are such a strong ambassador for history and that you encourage other people to explore that as well. Michael Morand is Director of Community Engagement at the Beinecke Library at Yale. He is also the official city historian for the city of New Haven. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Kalila.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you love an episode, please remember to leave us a comment. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.